So I'll make the introductions. The first is Patrick Burke. He's the current Senior Director of Player Safety for the NHL. He works out of their New York office. Prior to that, he spent 4 years as the Director of Player Safety, 7 years as a scout with the Philadelphia Flyers, and he's also the co-founder and former president of You Can Play. Dr. Nyaka Niilampti is the Director of Player Wellness for the National Football League Players Association. She was an athlete in college. She focused her thesis on the psychological impact sports can have on women. She's co-authored a book called The Career Game Plan, Preparing Student Athletes to Compete and Win in the World of Work. Also, Camille Quenneville, who's the CEO of the Canadian Mental Health Association, the Ontario division, spearheaded a joint mental health initiative with the Ontario Hockey League called Talk Today. It's a program that aims to raise awareness about suicide and promote the mental health of young athletes. Previously, she was the Director of Policy and Communications with Children's Mental Health Ontario. And Brian Ramsay, after a 10-year career playing guard in the CFL, now serves as the Executive Director of the CFL Players Association. So in his current role, he's focused on building active participation by players in their union and developing a strong consensus on all important issues. And last but not least, our moderator for this panel is Ralph Lean, who is Counsel in the Toronto office of Gowling and co-leader of the firm's Cuba initiative. He's a highly regarded business lawyer and trusted advisor to clients ranging from startups to global corporations. And since September 2011, he has been counsel in residence to the Ted Rogers School of Management. So this is Developments in Player Safety and Wellness.
Thank you very much. If you can't hear me or hear any of the speakers, raise your hand. I sat at the back sometimes, maybe just that I'm old. I couldn't hear all the time here. Second thing, the panels have been very, very polite. If you want to interrupt someone and tell them you disagree with them, that's okay. Just don't tell you disagree with the moderator. That's not allowed here. First question to Patrick. How come you don't wear a tie like your father?
I try to do a lot of things differently from my father, and draping a business scarf around my neck is high on that list. So
good answer. Good answer. I like you already. First question to you, Patrick. Your department oversees a lot of aspects related to player safety, but you're best known for issuing supplemental discipline for illegal plays. How would you say the cause of player safety is furthered by the NHL discipline process?
Well, like you said, our department is involved in a lot of different things, rule changes, equipment modifications, all aspects of player safety. But what we're most well known for and least popular for is issuing suspensions for players. And I think there's a reason that's under the player safety department at the NHL. I think as much as we want to make the game safe by changing rules, by modifying equipment, if we don't correctly and consistently enforce the rule book and punish players who are out there hurting their opponents, then the game can't get safer. So I think the consistent and forceful application of supplemental discipline really helps the NHL be a safer and better league.
Thank you. I want to congratulate the organizers for talking about mental health. For too long, people my age certainly wouldn't talk about it. We've got two panelists to talk about it. Congratulations, Brian and Trevor. So the first question, Doctor, is there have been a number of high-profile athletes across multiple leagues who've spoken out recently about their personal mental health challenges. How have you seen the conversation around player wellness and mental health change as a result of that?
I think one of the things that we've talked about is that we cannot underestimate the value that high-profile sports, high-profile athletes coming out and talking about their own mental health challenges have had in terms of players being willing to utilize the resources, talk about their struggles, ask for help, and whether it's other high-profile athletes, whether it's celebrity suicides. I think what's happened is really we've encouraged a little bit more of a dialogue around this, and I think what we're seeing is a trickle-down effect. I think what we're also sort of gradually starting to see the positive impacts that talking about mental health and seeking support for those kinds of concerns will actually have on player performance. So, we're seeing this a little bit more holistically, and I think that, there's a number of players, a number of high-profile athletes who have been willing to take the lead in this and really help both other professional athletes as well as youth athletes.
Thank you. Camille, follow up on the same topic. We're hearing a lot more about mental health generally now, when it was previously a very, very taboo subject. Have you noticed a change in how athletes address their mental health?
Thanks, Ralph. I just want to start by saying I certainly agree with the doctor, and I will just add that there is a lot less taboo now around mental health generally. I think we can all agree that unlike any other time before, we seem to hear a lot about it in the media. Journalists have taken up the cause, politicians have taken up the cause, and they've done it in the context of ensuring that we think about our mental health the same way we do our physical health. So perhaps it's not surprising that this is actually filtered into the sports world and that athletes are much more vocal when they are struggling. We certainly support that, and in fact we have been advocating very strongly for additional services to be available to everyone, including athletes, and we've had some success with a program that we've developed, which I'll talk about later, Ralph.
Okay, thank you. Brian, can you tell us about the CFL and the CFL Players Association joint approach to player safety, specifically relating to reduction of the number of padded contact practices as of September 2017?
Thanks, Ralph. Yeah, from a PA's perspective, I think it's our job to continue to challenge the league and ownership to institute these player safety initiatives, and one in particular, as you mentioned, was one about 12 months ago we put in, and that was the reduction of padded practices completely during the season. So players wear shoulder pads during training camp, and then once season hit, we went from 17 the year before to 0. And we've just got back some of the data, although raw and high level. After 12 months, we've seen a 33% reduction in injuries in the practice field. And what we're finding is the players are commenting that they're much more healthy as they go into games, and they're recovering much faster because they're having less contact in. So what I think we need to do moving forward is take that as a positive, realize that that's going to trickle down to the grassroots as well, and help overall growth.
Can I ask you all a question about bullying? I saw something on TV Saturday night in Nova Scotia, which was horrendous, how they bullied this young guy. What can players do? What can leagues do? I mean, I'd love to see hockey players, big football linemen in a commercial saying, you're going to attack this kid, you're coming through me. We as parents and grandparents have an obligation. I think we've got to do something. What's the NHL doing anything on bullying?
There's a variety of diversity and inclusion initiatives the NHL is involved in, including You Can Play, which, as was mentioned, I helped co-found. And I think to your broader point, we need more athletes and role models speaking up to say that it used to be called hazing, and people pretended that it was fun and lighthearted, and it's not. And excluding kids from sports and running kids off at a young age from sports is a serious problem. It has an effect on, they're better experts than I am, but sports has amazing positive benefits for mental health for kids. If kids are allowed to play sports and welcome to play sports, the mental health benefits are off the charts. And bullying and exclusion are keeping kids out of sports. And leagues need to have strong policies. Players need to be leaders, not followers. And we need to take care of our young people playing sports here.
Thank you. Doctor?
So I know that there are a number of players that have their sort of own initiatives that they support, and we've seen a lot of players speak out about bullying. Some of them have their own organizations, their own foundations that really are promoting this idea of inclusiveness. I think on the PA side, we aren't necessarily sort of focused on that piece, but we do talk a lot about, how do we make sure that players are supporting each other, make sure that players are sending positive messages down to youth sports as well.
Camille?
We like to talk about how we never really leave high school. There are always bullies in our lives. The bullies that you had in high school still exist somewhere. They're in a workplace somewhere. They're on a sports team somewhere. So we like to provide programs and services to help organizations deal with this. And we do that across Canada, actually. Clearly, it's not acceptable. I agree with you, Ralph. There's nothing I'd like more than to see more people call people out for that kind of behavior in an appropriate way. I think that's really where we're going to start to learn to destigmatize that kind of behavior and not legitimize it. So we have, as I said, we've actively put in place many workplace programs to deal with that kind of behavior.
Thank you. Were you a lineman, Brian? You're like big.
I was.
I'd like you in a
He's
commercial.
He's 6'8".
With a young kid
I asked.
saying, "You're going through me. You're going to bully this guy."
We do have a number of programs across the league and specifically at the team level, anti-bullying, where we get into schools and talk, and I think it ties directly into the mental health awareness discussion. And as a collective of sports and society, I think we want to get to a point where rather than quietly not bring it up, you want the person doing that behavior, the bullying behavior, to be the one that is then called out for the negative behavior. And I think you do that by removing the stigmas around it, and it's okay to talk about it, it's okay to either talk quietly or talk to a teammate or a coach or a parent about it. And I think when we get that change collectively around is when we're going to find that the members or people that are doing the bullying are going to stop, because they realize that they're now the outlier in that role.
Thank you.
Can I add to that too?
Absolutely, please.
And I think a large part of that too, though, is also increasing awareness about what bullying is.
Exactly.
Because I think sometimes in the culture of sport, we sort of normalize some of those behaviors. So while we talk about calling out the bully, sometimes you might need the skills to understand that, wait, I am the bully.
Yes,
And
exactly.
so, what do I need to do to kind of change some of those behaviors? So I think a large part of that is just increasing the awareness and making sure folks have a good, sort of, we're all using the same language when we define what a bully is.
And again, sorry, this transcends sport as well.
Yeah.
So what we can do is use sport as a platform to have the discussions at the school level, and it doesn't need to be inclusive to sport. It's anywhere. We want to try and address it.
It's not bullying. I just want to do a follow-up, because I heard Christine mention domestic violence, and the union leader says, "I got to protect my guy." Specifically the NFL, you guys were pretty bad. I'm going to read the paper with domestic violence over the last number of years. Is the league and the Players Association working together with a zero tolerance in the NFL?
So I know that every team does, every organization has a complete domestic violence program that they go through. One of the things that, again, I know that all of the teams also have rookie success programs where they have conversations about healthy relationships, making sure that, again, players are educated around what do positive relationships look like, building communication skills. So I think a large part of it, I think very similar to the bullying conversation, is how do we make sure that we are educating, increasing awareness, and then making sure that we are, that the consequences for behaviors are there's a term I'm looking for that I'm blanking on right now, but so that the consequences are severe enough where people understand that these are not behaviors that they continue to engage in.
You doing anything at the NHL on domestic violence?
The NHL and the NFL actually work with the same group called A Call to Men, which works to educate all of our athletes about healthy relationships, toxic masculinity, and how to treat our partners in our lives.
Okay. Ryan, CFL obviously is doing good stuff in that area.
Yeah, we do have a policy as well. And I think from listening to the earlier conversation, I think that portion of it was more about the process of it and ensuring the process and protocol was properly followed rather than the individual circumstance itself.
Okay, next
Ralph,
question.
can I just add, I don't normally speak for the Canadian Hockey League, but I think it should be noted that they too have programs for the young men in that league around respect for women, appropriate use of social media as it relates to those kinds of relationships as well. To their great credit, they've done an awful lot of work in this area to ensure that they're building not only great athletes, but very good young gentlemen.
Thank you. Patrick, can you talk about some other initiatives the NHL is looking at to increase player safety?
We're constantly looking at rule changes. We're constantly looking at equipment changes. It's difficult to make changes to the on-ice product of the game without changing the fundamental nature of the game. in ways we can't predict. So when you talk about, let's put in this rule, it would be almost a decade ago the league put in the illegal check to the head rule, Rule 48, to penalize hits that make the head the main point of contact. And that rule's evolved several times since it's been in. The application of the rule has been criticized or modified slightly as the rule's been changed. So what we found is when you try to make a change to the on-ice product, there's unanticipated consequences from that. So our department, along with Coley Campbell and Hockey Ops and his group that do a great job, are always looking at ways to make the game safer. The easiest ways to do that for us are equipment changes, environment changes, things that don't actually change the way the game is played while still making the game safer.
Thank you. Doctor, what are the wellness resources that are available to NFL players? How have those resources changed over the years? And how does the NFL Players Association encourage players to utilize those resources?
So I think one of the things that is not necessarily highly publicized is the fact that every NFL team, most of the NFL teams have a team clinician. And that team clinician, depending on the team, is integrated to varying degrees. So every team has access to someone who is trained in mental health, has a mental health background, understands the context of sports. But then in addition to that, players also have resources both on the NFL side, so whether they use those team clinicians, most of the teams have someone who works in the performance space, but then they also have incredible health insurance benefits. So there's Cigna has an NFL counseling assistance program where every single player has access to 8 free sessions per issue. And again, one of the things that we're doing on the PA side is encouraging the use of that. One of the things I tell players is that, I was in private practice before I came on the side, and so the idea of having free mental health access and mental health resources doesn't happen. So making sure that they really use those. I think the other thing that we're really working hard to do is to decrease the stigma that's associated with help-seeking behaviors. So making sure that players are aware of what are some of the signs and symptoms, not just for themselves, but also for their peers, but then also encouraging the use of those resources. So part of that, again, is making sure that they understand that we're not looking at just mental illness when we talk about mental health. I think a lot of times we tend to use those two terms synonymously, but really helping them to understand that, we're talking about how do we build positive mental health, and I think really using that kind of language encourages the use of those resources a little bit more.
Do you get support from the league? You're the Players Association. Do you work hand in? It seems to me you should in this area.
I think it's been very easy to say that in the mental health space, this is a very easy space to collaborate in. So this past year, we did a joint NFL Players Association Mental Health Forum in Atlanta with Cigna. We've done some work in suicide prevention for Suicide Prevention Month in September. So again, this is an easy space where we've been able to collaborate.
Okay, Camille, with respect to mental health, tell us about Talk Today and how that is a great example of changing views around mental health.
Thank you. We're all about reducing stigma as well, so certainly support that. Talk Today is a program that began in partnership between the Canadian Mental Health Association and the Ontario Hockey League. And unfortunately, it has a sad beginning in the death by suicide of a young player named Terry Trafford, who played with the Saginaw Spirit. Terry died in 2014, and at that time, we partnered with the league to provide both mental health awareness and suicide awareness supports to the young players in the Ontario Hockey League. So we paired up one of our branches. We have 30 branches across Ontario. The league has 20 teams, and we paired them together so that there was ongoing support to each of these teams. And we had really very good success in the early days, and Trevor Whiffen was a very big part of that. Since then, we have expanded the program across both the Western and Quebec Major Junior Hockey Leagues, and I'm really happy to report that today we've now trained over 3,500 young men in both suicide and mental health awareness. In addition to that, we've trained the Canadian Women's Hockey League, and we have now a whole host of partners across colleges and universities and their varsity teams, and the Junior League, those just younger than those in the CHL. We've trained up about half of them across the country as well. So to your point about having easy partnerships in mental health, this has been an easy partnership, and that's because we're all focused on the same thing, which is giving these young players the life skills that they need to understand their own mental health, but to also look at the people they're with and understand their mental health. So there are many stories that we've learned where these young men, who normally, let's face it, men in that age category aren't particularly interested in sitting down for 3 hours and being lectured about any subject, let alone mental health, but where they have not only taken it in, they've gone out and used these skills. And one in particular who noticed a classmate who was not functioning well, and it turned out this young person was suicidal, and that young hockey player, who had no relationship to this person, but simply because they had been trained, was able to get them the help that they needed. So tremendous success on that front, and all credit really goes to David Branch and Ron Robison and Gilles Courteau in the Ontario, Quebec, and Western hockey leagues, and to my colleagues across the country who do an extraordinary job managing this program as well.
I just think that access is so important. I talked publicly many times. I dealt with severe depression when I was in college, ended up dropping out of school for a while. And part of the reason I had to leave is the first time I went to go get help, I went to my campus's mental health center, and they told me I could have an appointment in a month to 6 weeks. And I was like, but I'm having problems now. What am I supposed to do for the next 6 weeks? So I think both with the NFLPA and especially Ontario Hockey League for young men, I think it's amazing what you're doing, providing that access to people.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and I admire you and I applaud you for speaking openly about that experience, because that's really what's going to break down stigma. But I can just tell you, separate and apart from our hockey experience, my organization also runs a campus mental health program to work with that population as well. But that said, it will be that generation. It will be the young men that are in the Canadian Hockey League, that age group now, who really will be, over time, the group that starts to break down the stigma, starts to speak more openly about their experience, and starts to really turn people's thinking around the importance of being honest about how they're doing.
Do you get enough help from the government? I worry when he says it takes them 5 or 6 weeks.
Yeah.
I don't know where you were, but are we getting enough help from the government, both federally and the new enlightened Ontario government?
Yeah.
I am politically involved. So.
Yes, you're right, Ralph. And I think what has been fascinating, without getting into a political discussion, is in the last election watching each of the three parties speak about mental health and speak very clearly about what their plan was. And so this government's plan is $1.8 billion investment over 10 years, matching the feds, who will also give $1.8 billion over that same period of time. So unlike in any time, and I've been in this business for quite some time, do I ever recall three parties, all of them, with very succinct plans about how they want to move forward. And I know, because it's my job and I'm at Queen's Park all the time, I know that they're acting on that already.
Okay. You need help, you call me. I told you that.
I will.
We're going to hold them to their commitments, federal and provincial governments. Brian, I want you to talk the need to ensure rehabilitation for workplace injuries suffered during professional sports. Talk about that issue, please.
I think it ties right into this topic as well, and talking where we left off of reducing hurdles and ensuring that we talked about the stigmas and ensuring we get to a point where an injury, you think of a knee injury 30 years ago and it was a career-ending knee injury, and mental health and mental wellness, and that is, once we get past that stigma, it's going to be okay to address and talk to and move forward, and I think that's going to be a positive. Specifically on this question, I think most are aware that professional athletes in general are not covered under a workers' compensation plan in Canada that differs from the US and the structure down there. What we need to do to ensure, all the way from grassroots up to the professional levels, is that there's appropriate coverage and rehabilitation for athletes in every sport, for injuries sustained on the field, for injuries sustained off the field. For any type, we need to ensure that there's less hurdles, less stigmas, and ultimately more coverage for all players.
I just want to ask the two guys from football and hockey, can sports like hockey and football ever be safe, fully safe? Patrick?
No, hockey's a contact sport played by big, strong athletes in an enclosed environment with a puck that's being batted around at 100 miles per hour. No, it can never be made fully safe. Even the women's game, which I love, which is no hitting, it's still contact, but no hitting, there are injuries in that. So the game of hockey with full contact, with high speed, no, we can't make it fully safe.
Ryan?
I would agree. I would say what we try and do is we try and mitigate risk by instilling different safety initiatives, and then on the rehabilitation side, what we have to come to a realization is that even by mitigating that risk, there is going to be, even in what it is deemed in, any play could result in an injury. And we have to accept that and realize that we have to put the right process and protocol in place to ensure that athletes are properly rehabilitated for that, because of that risk is always going to be there.
Okay. Doctor, what are the biggest barriers in the wellness space for players? How do you begin to overcome those barriers?
I mean, I think part of it is sort of what we're doing today, right? So a large part of it is the stigma that's still associated with help-seeking behaviors. The lack of awareness, the difficulty accessing resources, knowing what those resources are. And so, to me, I think the first steps are really encouraging the dialogue, making sure that we're educating, again, both the players as well as what we like to say is everyone who's in their ecosystem, right? So, whether that's the agents, whether that's the parents, whether that's the coaches, and understanding and helping them to understand that this is, again, one of the things we talk about is this idea that we prepare physically and we make sure that our bodies are strong, but what are the things that we're doing on the mental side? And the idea that I'm going to reach peak performance just developing the physical without the mental does not make sense. So making sure that we're having these conversations and we're educating everyone that's involved, I think those are the important steps.
Can I ask the two mental health people, is there a role for agents in the sports to be more enlightened and do something? And is there a reach out to them? Because they run into these kids, they sign them up from the time they're 15, 16. Is there a way of educating them?
I mean, one of the things that I do is for all of our agent seminars, I will do some type of a presentation. We send out a wellness newsletter. We make sure that the agents are included. For some of these agents, they are almost the players' parents, right? And so they become sort of all things. And so the more educated they are, the better equipped they are to make sure that their players are getting the resources they need. I have conversations with agents a lot. And whether that's what are some signs and symptoms? How do I make sure that I figure out what resources they have available and put them in place where they can get access to those resources. There's no question that agents play a key role in this.
And Camille, do you have any contact with the sports agents?
Not agents, Ralph, but I will expand just briefly on Talk Today. And to your point about ecosystems, part of Talk Today is not just about the players. It's about the coaches, assistant coaches, parents, billet parents, which are a big part of the story for young players in the CHL. They all also have the ability to be trained in a program that we've developed as well. So this is extremely important because if the young person is struggling, it's one thing for them to have awareness. It's quite another for those around that young person to recognize those signs and symptoms and be able to put some supports in place very quickly.
Okay. A question for Brian, another subject, concussions. And you probably can't talk about anything legal, but what of the changes being made in your sport with respect to concussions? I know that there are protocols, but what's the movement and any future things you might do?
Well, I think it needs to continually evolve. When we talk about player safety specifically, we talk in conjunction with rehabilitation. So knowing that there's always going to be some type of risk in contact sports, we have to address the rehabilitation side and know that with that risk, athletes in any sport are going to need to be properly rehabilitated beyond an injury. And then what we need to continue as leagues and sports is evolve our game to mitigate that risk, to try and take as much of the specific risk around head injuries away. And we need to keep having the conversations and keep addressing it, which is something I think we're doing.
Okay. Patrick, you're from the NHL. You're a player association. How do you work with the NHL Player Association on reducing injuries?
from my role in the NHL, we have a great relationship with the NHLPA. I might not be in the more heated negotiations that go on at higher levels, but player safety works closely with the NHLPA on a number of joint health and safety committees that look at various things like equipment, like concussions, overall health and safety, and rule changes. At times it's adversarial. They represent the players when we have a hearing, and will advocate for that player to get maybe a lower suspension, or in their mind an appropriate suspension. But I think the player safety department's relationship with the NHLPA is very strong, and we like that they're out there looking out for their players as well.
Thank you. Doctor, how does your background in sports psychology help inform the work that you do in player wellness?
I think one of the benefits of having the background in sports psych is that it makes it easier to approach mental health from a much more holistic perspective. So again, one of the things that we talk about is how do we reach players where they are? So while players might not necessarily be willing to talk about, at least initially, about mental health or how they're feeling or stress, they are able to talk about performance and wanting to enhance performance. And I think having that sports psych background, I think it expands the perspective and makes it easier to find ways to integrate all of these pieces into how players are performing.
Okay. Camille, what would you tell a young player about their mental health if they were afraid to speak up for fear of being sidelined?
Well, this is where we talk about, as we have already this morning, how mental health and physical health, there should be parity, how we should think of them in the same way, and that if you're struggling, you're struggling. It's part of life, whether you're struggling with broken ribs or some anxiety. It should all be considered the same thing, and there should be no shame and no judgment, and that these young people should feel free to reach out, and they should have the support of their teammates, of the coaching staff, and the league as well. And it's one thing for those of us who work in the mental health business to talk this way. It's quite another for people like David Branch, when we started Talk Today, to talk about how important that this was, and for Mike Babcock, who's been on record many times talking about the difference between seeking help for mental health and having mental toughness on the ice, and encouraging people to be mindful of the difference between the two and to seek support when they need it.
Okay, Brian,
I'm jumping in on that, because if that young person is in the audience, or if someone's tweeting or whatever, I wouldn't be up here today if I didn't get mental health assistance. I wouldn't be up here today if I hadn't gone to therapy, if I hadn't been on antidepressants for a significant period of time. My life would have gone very differently if, at a young age, I hadn't sought help and had the support of my friends and family. So you talk to a young player and they're like, I don't want to miss some games, or I'm nervous I won't get drafted. There's no way that your career will be negatively affected by taking care of your brain. There's no downside. There's no negative effect. If you slip around in the draft because some GM is too stupid to know how important this is, you're still going to be better off and be a better player, because your brain is going to be healthy and enabled you to be healthy on the ice.
So case in point, Ralph. Cool. It's one thing for me to say it. It's quite another to hear that.
Terrific. One more question, then we're going to turn it over to the audience. If you want to think about your questions, line up at the microphone. You're allowed to ask a question of any panelist, just not the moderator here, who's incapable of answering. Brian, same question I asked Patrick. How well do you work with the CFL and the Player Association on the specific issue of sports injuries?
I think it's a strong relationship in that front, and it's easy to have a strong relationship because everyone should be wanting the same goal, right? And it's a healthier game, it's a safer game, and it's sustainability of the game. So when it comes to logistically, it's sometimes not easy things to do and implement when you're looking and talking about changing the game and how that's going to affect. But from a relationship standpoint, I think it's important that we have the opportunity to both sides to be able to communicate, and that has been there right now, and that's probably pushed more from a player's perspective, which is understood, and that's something that from an association standpoint we need to continue to do, is continue to challenge to say, hey, this can be okay if we can do this and change this, and here's how we're going to help you do it.
Any questions from the audience? I see a guy coming. Oh, I see two guys. No, one guy's just got his coffee. One guy here. Come on, be tougher there. Tell me your name. What's your name?
My name's Mario.
And where are you from?
Durham College Sport Business Graduate Program.
Good.
First of all, I just wanted to thank everyone on the panel for giving their knowledge and perspective. I think it's really important, so I appreciate that. This question is directed for Brian. Brian, with the new current CFL CBA expiring on May 15, 2019, what are you looking to accomplish from a player and safety and wellness perspective for your players in this new deal?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a great one. I think going into this specific collective agreement, as you said, expiring in May after this next year, upcoming year, we've got to address this. And I think when we go into negotiating, this is going to be hopefully a portion of those discussions where it's mutual discussion into it. It's going to be less bargaining back and forth, because there should be a lot of results there that are to the benefit of everybody. And one of the things that we need to do from the association is make sure that those pieces are put on the proposal for sure, but again, the hope would be that they're well received to make these positive changes that are going to help everyone in the league.
Yeah, and maybe you can touch upon what you wrote in your article earlier this year about full care, if you want to touch on that quickly.
Sure.
I think it's important.
Sure, and that was one of the earlier questions today about the full rehabilitation. And as I said, most people in the room know that there isn't currently workers' compensation for professional athletes. And one of these pieces that we've discussed and discussed here today was ensuring that athletes are completely covered for injuries, physically or mentally, suffered in the workplace, which is, for us, the field, the rink, or what have you. And we need to ensure, continue to obviously have these discussions as we head into bargaining, but have these discussions over and over and over so that it just becomes commonplace and it's to the benefit of all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next, tell us your name and where you come from.
Well, I'm from Victoria, BC, but I'm with Osgoode Hall Law School.
I went to Osgoode Hall Law School before you were born.
It's a great school. My question is with regards to player safety. It's with regards
That's good, because that's what this panel is about, so that's helpful.
I guess the question's for the entire panel then. So does a player safety, there's been a lot of discussion lately about players putting themselves in positions to get injured. Does player safety take this into account when assessing penalties? And there's just as a follow-up, does player safety consider individual coaching or do coaches consider this when developing strategies on the ice or something like that?
There are several rules in the NHL rulebook that provide allowances for a play to occur if the player who gets hit changes his body position or his head position immediately prior to or simultaneous with contact. The illegal check to the head rule has a provision for that. Boarding has a provision for that, being the two most notable examples. So if you're along the boards and you're facing me head on, and right as I'm about to hit you, you whip around and give me your back, and I can't stop and I go right through you, that's not a penalty in the NHL rulebook. We refer to it in shorthand as turning just prior. Similarly, Rule 48, subsection 1, subsection 2, has an allowance if the opponent materially changes the position of his head just prior to or simultaneous with contact in a way that significantly contributes to the head being the main point of contact. It's a very interesting rule to read. So yes, there are certain rules in the NHL rulebook that take into account the player being hit's behavior right before the hit and can excuse what might look like a bad hit from discipline.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
You want the other panelists want to jump in on that? You would ask it. Oh,
Sure.
you sure? And then I see another. Oh, way to go!
Oh, thank you.
So he'll answer. Then I was ragging the puck because I didn't see you. And then there's another guy coming, or he's coming. Oh, good.
I'll be very quick then.
Quick, Brian.
Yeah, very quick. I think what you have to be careful on that specific question is on the consistency of the discipline, because you can have an injury from, as mentioned before, any play, and you can have a play that where there's discipline and there's no injury. So I think when you're combining those two, it can be very dangerous to do so. And when you're doing, you got to ensure that there's consistency applied.
Thank you. What now? We have a question.
Hi there.
What's your name?
My name is Tanya.
From where?
I come from a company called BE Works. We're a managing consultancy firm that works on behavioral economics. But my question is based on my other passions, which are, I guess, progression of LGBTQ issues, especially in sport. And given that clearly there's a gamut of work involved in what you all do, what's the state of the LGBTQ, I guess, policy that would kind of allow or enable more queer athletes to have a voice in your respective?
Well, at the NHL level, we have a pretty firm inclusion policy written into the collective bargaining agreement that includes sexual orientation. We've also been proud partners with You Can Play from the beginning, and I'm kind of wearing two hats here because, as we know, I used to work for and founded You Can Play. But our diversity and inclusion efforts around the LGBT community are, I think, leading the professional sports world. At the same time, I think there's always room for an improvement because there are not a significant number of queer voices speaking at the NHL level or on behalf of the NHL level. And I think the early stages of LGBTQ inclusion in the National Hockey League were about changing the culture by giving allies a little bit of room to talk about, hey, we should support our gay teammates, our gay family members, our LGBTQ friends and family, to let especially young athletes know, like, hey, Henrik Lundqvist is on board, John Tavares is on board. You being homophobic is not acceptable in the National Hockey League. And stage two now that we're working on and really working hard to identify LGBTQ voices in the space who can share their stories and amplify their own message. I think the time of straight voices dominating this conversation should be ending, should already have ended, and we need to do a much better job of empowering LGBTQ voices within that space.
Anybody else? What is the NFL? You doing anything? These guys are doing good stuff here. You follow my NHL friends. What are you doing?
So here's what I'd say on the PA side. So I think the allies is a big piece where, again, where we're seeing individual players who have their own organizations who are supportive of LGBTQ issues. I think the other thing is what we're seeing is more and more college sports are integrating certainly some of these groups in the work that they're doing. So we're getting more guys who are coming into the league already used to having this conversation. So I do think that we're getting more players who are willing to use their voice in support of.
And to back up the NFL and the CFL here, they're both partners with You Can Play as well. Wade Davis, who worked for You Can Play as our pro sports outreach director, works with the CFL and the NFL to help train their athletes. I marched in the New York City Pride Parade this year with the NHL, and right behind us was the NFL float with two former NFL players. So for all the patting on the back I'm giving the NHL here, we're the only major men's professional league that has not had a current or retired player come out publicly. So we're clearly not doing enough to make this work.
Okay, last question. What's your name and where are you from?
Phil Mazzocchi, and I'm from Durham College Sport Business graduate student. And I was wondering, technology has had such a big impact on player physical safety. Technology has had such an influence on player physical safety. I was wondering if it had much of an influence on mental health and how it might be making advances in that category.
Who wants to take that?
Do you want to start? I can certainly start. So what we are doing now is we're making more technology-based support available to players. So, I know that, for example, Headspace and the NBA have formed a partnership. They've done some work there. We've made those kinds of things available to players, whether it's Calm, some of the meditation apps, also utilizing some of the other technology-based platforms where players can get access to more resources without having to actually sit face-to-face with someone. We're making some of those things available to them on the PA side as well.
I'll be brief because I know we're running out of time. I'll just say that yes, we have many partners who are in the app development business. Some of them are running apps currently, but we do know that, interestingly enough, from our campus program, that most young people actually don't want to use an app, which is counterintuitive because they're on their phone all the time. But they actually want to talk to somebody. So we have a really great program, I say unbiased, called Bounce Back, which is telephone-based coaching, not counseling. So very accessible, allows people the ability to use it when they wish. with coaches at the other end of the line, overseen by psychologists who provide support to individuals. We manage it with 20 different languages here across Ontario.
I want to thank our spectacular panel, who are all experts in their area. And if you get to vote on the best panel, as long as we beat Brian Burke's panel, I'll be happy. Thank you very much.